A very good afternoon to Professor Timothy Clark, Provost, Singapore Management University, Professor Jia Li, Dean, SMU, School of Economics, Professor Houston Kwa, President, Economic Society of Singapore, the chairperson for this panel, Professor Eugene Tan, School of Law, SMU, my fellow panelists, as well as everyone here. I would first like to thank the ESS and SMU for inviting me to speak about Sino-US competition and regional security. Thank you. Now, what I want to do in my remarks on this topic is to provide an unfamiliar answer to the familiar question of what regional states are to make of US-China competition. My presentation will be divided into three main parts. First, I will speak about how the US has constructed China and its rise as a security issue. Second, I therefore clarify the terms of Sino-US competition today. Third, I discuss what regional states may then do in the face of such. To be sure, my remarks today draw upon two journal articles I have published on this matter, and I'll be more than happy to send these to anyone who might still be interested in this topic after hearing me drone on about it for the next 18 minutes or so. Now, to begin with, what exactly has the US said about China? We often see sensational headlines in the news, such as that, I quote, US says challenges posed by China exceed those of Cold War, end quote, which was in the Straits Times just last month. However, the scarcity of sustained and systematic analysis of US governmental discourse with regard to China and its rise in terms of security is a puzzling one. After all, over the years, despite dramatic headlines, the US has also given many reassurances on and to China itself. For instance, then President Barack Obama had said many times that he has been very explicit in saying that the US has more to fear from a weakened, threatened China than the successful rising China. Or even as the Trump administration engaged upon the so-called trade and tech wars against China, then President Donald Trump himself hid the great respect he had for China and for President Xi Jinping. Were these then simply mendacious rhetoric of goodwill and cooperation masking nefarious purposes of struggle and competition? Instead, in my study of US governmental security discourse in relation to China and its rise from 2006 to 2020, in terms of various official public documents, such as the US National Security Strategy, the annual threat assessment by the US National Director of National Intelligence, or the annual reports by the US Department of Defense and the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. On top of actual US security practices towards China, I make three important findings here. First, the US has only constructed China as an actual threat to its own national security in two specific areas: cybersecurity and economic competition. Allow me to elaborate here. In terms of cybersecurity, this US representation of China as a cyber threat is in spite of the typical difficult and uncertain attribution of cyber attacks. For example, the US claimed in the 2008 annual report on China's military that cyber attacks appear to have originated within the PRC, and even if it is unclear if these intrusions were conducted by or with the endorsement of the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, or other elements of the PRC government, developing capabilities for cyber warfare is consistent with authoritative PLA writings on the subject. The cyber threat from China has been a long-standing one. The Financial Times, for instance, reported that the Chinese military hacked the Pentagon in 2007. The US thus put in place several measures to combat this Chinese cyber threat, including setting up its cyber command in 2010. In 2015, a high-profile meeting between Obama and Xi resulted in both pledging, I quote, that their governments would refrain from computer-enabled theft of intellectual property for commercial gain, end quote. The cyber threat from China is therefore linked to the Chinese economic threat as well. This Chinese economic threat is exemplified by the US's huge trade deficit with China, which has increased from 6 billion in 1985 to almost 0.4 trillion in 2022. In 2011, the Committee for Foreign Investment in the United States annual report even highlighted that the US international intelligence community judges with moderate confidence that there is likely a coordinated strategy among one or more foreign governments or companies to acquire US companies involved in research, development, or production of critical technologies for which the US is a leading producer. It further noted that foreign governments are extremely likely to continue to use a range of collection methods to obtain critical US technologies, including espionage, in addition to emphasizing increased Chinese investment in the United States. The US started the biannual strategic economic dialogue with China in 2006 to manage economic relations and the trade imbalance. This led to the Chinese renminbi, under a fixed exchange rate, to appreciate by a fifth against the US dollar by 2009. Nevertheless, the cyber and economic threats from China continue to persist despite the various measures. During the Trump administration, the US therefore pursued the so-called trade and tech wars against China, imposing high tariffs on China and banning Huawei from the US's 5G network. These were simply different ways that Trump attempted to resolve these threats. And though many had expected that the succeeding Biden administration's approach ought to be less confrontational, but instead what we saw was that the Biden administration continued these trade and tech wars, and this should not be surprising because previous security practices had simply not worked. My second finding is therefore that the US has represented China's rise as a collective risk in the international community across the military, political, and economic sectors rather than a threat. What does this mean? Risk and threats differ in three crucial areas. As economists, I'm sure you appreciate this. Their causality, temporality, and handling. Whereas a threat is often explicit and direct, a risk is about potential danger which is much less computable. While threats are frequently urgent, risks are more persistent, encompassing, and typically future-oriented. And although a threat may be overcome, a risk is more about proactive management or prevention at the very beginning. For instance, with reference to climate change, there may be a threat of violent conflict in the face of limited and degrading resources, which may be overcome by political or military interventions in countries and regions that face such climate-induced conflicts or instability. But in comparison, the risk from climate change may be mitigated by building resilience in the population instead. Specifically, the US has constructed China's rise as a military risk towards peace and stability in the Asia-Pacific due to its military build-up. It has also represented China's practices as it rises as a political risk to the rules-based order, especially because of Chinese aggressions and transgressions in its East and South China Sea claims. The US has further portrayed China as an economic risk to the market-based economic order due to its unfair trade practices that has helped it grow to become the second largest economy in the world. There are many examples of such depictions in US government discourse from 2006 to 2020, but let me focus on the actual security practices to demonstrate US preventive actions to mitigate such risk. Under the Obama administration, the military aspects of the 2012 rebalance or pivot to the Asia-Pacific, if you remember this, exemplified US security practices met towards a future-oriented Chinese military build-up. Right? Likewise, the Trump administration's free and open Indo-Pacific strategy largely continued the Obama administration's pivot. In the political sector, US routine security practices reinforced the idea that China's practices were not acceptable and did not conform to the rules-based order. They aimed to emphasize the freedom of navigation while pressuring China with the weight of a multilateral security architecture, as opposed to punishing it as if it were a threat instead. US Freedom of Navigation Operations, or FONOPS for short, is a good example here. These are about protesting against China's excessive maritime claims rather than confronting or sanctioning China. Similarly, US engagement of the various Asia-Pacific multilateral institutions and its regional allies and partners added to its construction of China's rise as a risk to this rules-based order. At times, this multilateral architecture included China, enabling positive sum gains to be achieved. US security practices in the economic sector focus upon bolstering an economic order that would conceivably nudge China to play by what it deems as fair economic rules, as opposed to multilateral sanctions against China threatening the global economic order. During the Obama administration, this took the form of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. The TPP was meant to precautionarily level the economic playing field, ensuring that modern, fair, and pro-growth rules were adopted in Asia, while concurrently enabling Asian trade partners more opportunities for growth and reduce their vulnerability to economic coercion by China or other large economies. The US would even welcome China's participation in the TPP should it meet the criteria of membership. Unfortunately, it had also put the TPP at a very high standard, which China was unlikely to achieve in the short term. Under Trump, the US gave up on the TPP, believing that it was a bad deal for the US, and instead turned to other initiatives like the Indo-Pacific Transparency Initiative or the better utilization of investment leading to Development Act for the same purposes as the TPP. Overall, therefore, I find that the US is managing the security implications from China and its rise in an actually very comprehensive manner, with differentiated strategies in different sectors. This included the US security practices of routinely engaging China through institutions or other forms of multilateralism, while at the same time preventively building partnerships with other allies and partners in the region via military interoperability and cooperation, or trade agreements, on top of combating the Chinese threats to US domestic national security. This is then the more precise depiction of Sino-US competition today, as opposed to mistaken speculation about the Second Cold War between the US and China. The defining characteristics of the Cold War were ultimately that it was first an ideological struggle between, second, two military blocs, right? The Western Capitalist Democratic North Atlantic Treaty Organization versus the Communist Warsaw Pact. In Sino-US competition today, thankfully, both elements of this ideological struggle and extensive military alliances are still largely absent. Now, the US is not trying to contain China, therefore, like it did against the former Soviet Union during the Cold War. It is once again attempting to manage the security implications from China and its rise in a comprehensive manner. Let me now turn to what this then means for states in the region. To be sure, different states in the region naturally take to the US construction of China and its rise in security terms differently. Take, for instance, Singapore, where we are all seated here today. Though Singapore generally accepts the US representation that China is a risk to the collective in the military and political sectors, it rejects that China's rise is a risk in the economic sector, seeing this more of an economic opportunity instead. Generally speaking, however, regional states recognizes that there are risks within the international system today, some of which even arise from Sino-US competition. The method of dealing with such risk is therefore the idea of hedging. Unlike how most people use hedging loosely to basically mean straddling a middle path, if you would, between the US and China via a mixed approach, which is actually meaningless because how would one determine wherein lies that exact middle, right? Especially when there is a mix of very different things and policies. I define hedging as, first and foremost, a strategy to proactively manage risk. Take Singapore's approach to the TPP. Unlike the US construction of China as an economic risk to the markets-based economic order, Singapore's point of view is that the economic risk is from protectionism and isolationism, as opposed to openness and globalization, on top of Sino-US economic competition impairing and derailing the world's economic system adversely, right? Therefore, affecting Singapore's prosperity. To Singapore, the TPP was but one approach to mitigate such risk, with Singapore leveraging on other economic agreements with various parties, such as a bilateral free trade agreement with the US in 2003 and with China in 2009, or the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP, which included China but not the US, even as it was negotiating the TPP with the US. To Singapore, the TPP was designed so that other economies can join in and accede to the TPP, and Singapore hoped that eventually China would join the TPP. Singapore's approach to the TPP thus differed greatly from the US's with respect to China. Hedging is therefore not about not taking sides, but that states retain their own agency and remain non-aligned by proactively managing risks, or rather to always choose its own side. Ultimately, hedging is about remaining sovereign and autonomous instead of being shackled to a great power. Let me now conclude by offering a few caveats to what I have said thus far. The first one to note is that although the US has generally not characterized China and its rise as a threat, save in terms of its own national security, in relation to cybersecurity and economic security, this, however, does not mean that a war between the two would never occur. Rather, all too often, miscalculations and misperceptions cause war. And these are precisely what everyone ought to keep in mind to prevent lest mistakes result in a war that no one wants. Furthermore, although the US construction of risks from China's rise are more prevalent, this does not therefore necessarily translate into a rosy picture. Instead, it is clearly the case that various practices over the years have not improved matters, and we can only expect Sino-US competition to increase hence. Beyond the headline I pointed out at the beginning of my remarks, right, the headline in the Straits Times, was that what US Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell was saying was that, I quote, "The Cold War pales in comparison to the multifaceted challenges that China represents. It's not just the military challenges, it's across the board," end quote. Risks might not be as urgent as threats, but they can be even more encompassing. Finally, although intensifying competition between the US and China might aggravate the risk involved, it does not necessarily shrink the space available for a hedging strategy. Even as there is greater competition, other states can still promote more military cooperation, encourage institutional enmeshment, or advocate open economic systems, for example, right, to manage the risks and uncertainties involved. Increased competition between great powers does not turn risk to threats. It is only when there are urgent threats that hedging is no longer relevant, and states need to work on other strategies with exceptional measures required to confront threats, such as military balancing or bandwagoning. It thus behoves all states to recognize these and work towards managing Sino-US competition, precisely to prevent risks from turning into threats. If you recall what Minister Chang said earlier this morning, right, this is precisely what the rest of the world, right, the 2/3 or 3/4 of the world's other economies should basically devote themselves towards. Thank you very much.